Hi Orion, how are you guys? I hope you all will be doing well, guys. Let's join to the today last session. Yeah, guys, to join to the today last session, tapping the screen to share the love, having a lot of love and respect for your joining, and making the like, subscribing to the channel. Yeah, guys, a lot of love and respect for you joining, and hope you all will be doing well for the today, guys. Let's join to the today last session. And yeah, guys, you should have to write your name in the chat and spread the love on the screen, guys. All right, guys, and yeah, and also send your flag of your country, guys. Wait, I will be now. Where are you from watching? Branson, how are you, dear Branson? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Malali brother. How are you, dear Branson? Thank you so much for watching from USA, dear Branson. A lot of love for the for the US people. They have to join my stream and also to support me on the screen for the US people. I never forget the greatness of the US people, guys. And thank you so much for you joining, Branson. How are you, my lovely brother? Thank you so much for you joining, dear Branson. A lot of love and respect. Zori, how are you, dear Zori? Thank you so much for you joining, dear Zori. Barira, how are you, Barira? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Aurora, how are you, dear Aurora? Thank you so much for you joining, dear Aurora. A lot of love and respect. Coco, your brother is Coco. Coco, how are you, dear Coco? Thank you so much for you joining, brother. Aurora, I write your name. Alisa, how are you, dear Alisa? Thank you so much for you joining, pretty Alisa. Thank you so much for you joining, pretty. Anna, how are you, dear Anna? Thank you so much for you joining, dear Anna. Hurry up, guys. Every respected people have to write your name in the chat, guys. Jayo, how are you, dear Jayo? Musa, how are you, dear Musa? Thank you so much for you joining, Lali Musa. Thank you. Thank you so much for you joining. Sarah, how are you, pretty Sarah? Thank you so much for you joining, pretty Sarah. Wendy, how are you, dear Wendy? That's a palm, guys. That's a palm. That's a palm. Just you should have to write your name, and if you wanna can support, click on my goal to support. Yeah. Bira, I write your name. Aline, how are you, dear Aline? Thank you so much for you joining, Aline. Aline. And also, you can send the laughing disco for my appreciation. Yeah, guys. Ari, how are you, dear Ari? Thank you so much for your journey, Ari. Aline, I write your name, my love. Bira, I write your name, dear Bira. Danny, how are you, dear Danny? Thank you so much for joining. Where are you from watching, Malali Danny? Thank you so much for your joining. Tara, how are you, Tara? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Tara. Thank you so much for your joining. Namor, I write your name, Namor. Thank you so much for your joining to stream. Thank you, Namor. How are you, dear Namor? Where are you from watching, dear Namor? Thank you so much for your joining. Kayan, how are you, dear Kayan? Thank you so much for your joining to stream, dear Kayan. You are from Portugal. Thank you so much for watching from Portugal. Alex, how are you, dear Alex? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Alex. Thank you so much for your joining, Alex. How are you, Alex? A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you so much, guys. If you have trying to spam on the screen, you will be get the time order from my screen, guys. Thank you so much for you joining. Thank you. Dago, how are you, dear Dago? Thank you so much for you joining. Yeah, guys, don't trying to spam on the screen. I know the US, UK, Canadian, Brazilian, and Australian people, they have never spam on the screen. They are very professional. Yeah, they have just to write their names and also to separate the law on the screen, and also they never to have spam on the screen. Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you for your joining, guys. Thank you. Airmark, how are you, Airmark? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Airmark, how are you, dear Airmark? Thank you so much for your joining. Yes, I am Muslim, my lovely brother. Alhamdulillah, I am Muslim. Thank you so much for your joining. Every up, guys, every respected member have to write your name in the chat and send the laughing disco for the appreciation for spreading the love, guys. Yeah, you can also to do the super chat for the supporting, guys. Thank you so much. Yeah, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. Ali, how are you, dear Ali? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Ali. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you. Jacob, how are you, dear Jacob? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Jacob. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Vikesh, how are you, dear Vikesh? Thank you so much for your joining, Vikesh. How are you, Vikesh? Thank you so much for joining my ring. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Matteo, how are you, Matteo? Thank you so much for your joining, Matteo. A lot of love and respect for your joining, my dear. Thank you so much for joining my ring. Akesh, how are you, dear Akesh? Thank you so much for your joining. Don't write the much name, guys. You should have to write Leon. How are you, dear Leon? Where are you from watching, dear Leon? Thank you so much for joining my ring. Thank you. Cici, how are you, dear Cici? Thank you so much for your joining my ring. Cheering, and thank you so much for your joining, cheering. Olivia, how are you, Olivia? Thank you so much for your joining, Olivia. Thank you so much. Don't spam, guys. Don't spam. Algeria, and sorry, Angelia. How are you, Angelia? Thank you so much for your joining, Angelia. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Aaron, how are you, dear Aaron? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Aaron. Siba, how are you, dear Siba? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Siba. How are you, pretty Siba? Thank you so much for your joining, Siba. A lot of love and respect for your joining, pretty Siba. Bilal, how are you, Bilal? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Bilal. David, how are you, dear David? Thank you so much for your joining, dear David. A lot of love and respect. Ivania, how are you, dear Ivania? Thank you so much for joining, pretty Ivania. Where are you from watching, Ivania? Thank you so much for your watching. Nisa, how are you, dear Nisa? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty Nisa. Thank you so much for your joining. Mila, how are you, pretty Mila? Thank you so much for your joining, Mila. Bella, how are you, Bella? Thank you so much for your joining, Bella. How are you, dear Bella? Thank you so much for joining. Dehi, yeah, how are you, Dehi? Thank you so much for joining to stream. And Captain, how are you, dear Captain? Elisa, how are you, dear Elisa? Thank you so much for your joining. Bella, I write your name, my dear. Liv, how are you, dear Liv? Thank you so much for your joining, Liv. How are you, Liv? Thank you so much for joining. Khadija, how are you, dear Khadija? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, pretty Khadija. Liv, I write your name, Liv. Zara, how are you, dear Zara? Thank you so much for joining. Andrea, how are you, dear Andrea? Thank you so much for joining, Andrea. Ayan, how are you, dear Ayan? Thank you so much for joining, Ayan. Thank you so much for your joining. Baglam, how are you, Baglam? Thank you so much for joining, Baglam. A lot of love and respect for your joining, my dear. Thank you so much for your joining. Our respected member have to join the stream. Julia, how are you, dear Julia? Thank you so much for joining. Vina, how are you, pretty Vina? Thank you so much for your joining, Vina. Addie, how are you, dear Addie? Thank you so much for joining, Addie. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining, Addie. How are you, dear Addie? A lot of love and respect for your joining, making the like and subscribing to the channel. All man, how are you, all man? Thank you so much for joining to stream, all man. Thank you. Annie, how are you, dear Annie? Thank you so much for joining, Annie. Irina, how are you, dear Irina? Where are you from watching, dear Irina? Thank you so much for your joining, pretty. Dihia, I write your name, my dear. Looks that I write your name in the land. How? Yeah, thank you so much for your joining. Thank you, guys. Don't trying to spam, guys. Don't try. If you have to spam, trying to spam, you will be got the time out. Valan, how are you, dear Valan? Thank you so much for joining. Carly, how are you, dear Carly? Thank you so much for joining, Carly. Valentina, how are you, Valentina? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Valentina. Thank you. Maju, how are you, dear Maju? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Maju. To write, yeah, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys, and send the laughing disco. And yeah, guys, send the laughing disco to write your name in the chat. To write your name in the chat, guys, and don't forget to subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for your joining. Everybody have to write your name in the chat, guys. Don't forget to writing your name in the chat, guys. Thank you so much for your joining. And Nima, how are you, pretty Nima? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, pretty Nina. Jojo, how are you, dear Jojo? Thank you so much for joining. Leokas, how are you, dear Leokas? Thank you so much for your joining, Leokas. Yeah, guys, click on my goal to do a small donation, guys. Yeah, to help me to completing my goal, make a small donation, guys. Thank you so much for your joining, dear Leokas. Adito, how are you, Adito? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, Adito. Malik, how are you, dear Malik? Thank you so much for your joining, Malik. How are you, dear Malik? Thank you so much for your joining. Tassia, how are you, dear Tassia? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Tassia. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Every respected member, thank you so much for your joining, guys. James, how are you, dear James? Thank you so much for your joining, James. How are you, James? Leo, how are you, dear Leo? Thank you so much for joining, Leo. Thank you. Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. Don't spam, guys. Don't spam. Leo, I write your name, my dear. Looks that I write your name, my dear. Thank you so much for your joining. Leo, I write your name, my dear. Dip, how are you, dear Dip? If you have to trying to spam, you will be got the time only from the screen for the 24-hour, guys. Yeah, thank you so much for your joining. Liv, looks that Liv, your first name is Liv. Liv, why you are spamming? Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you. Every respected member, don't trying to spam, guys. Julia, how are you, dear Julia? Thank you so much for your joining, Julia. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Yonchi, how are you, dear Yonchi? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Yonchi. How are you, Yonchi? Thank you so much for your joining, my dear. Julia, I write your name, my lovely brother. Yo-yo, I write your name, my dear. Please, guys, it's a request from the every members to don't spamming, guys. Yeah. Thank you. Welcome, my dear. Jojo, you can also send laughing disco. You can send, you can for the support. You can also to do a super chat. Thank you so much for your joining. Jasmary, how are you, Jasmary? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Jasmary. Thank you so much for your joining. I subscribe, Hamid. Thank you so much for subscribing, Hamid. Thank you so much, dear Hamid. Ali, how are you, dear Ali? A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you, Ali. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for subscribing. Yeah, guys, you should have to write your name in the chat, guys. Don't trying to spam. Asia, how are you, dear Asia? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Asia. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Harry, how are you, dear Harry? Thank you so much for joining. Arab, how are you, dear Arab? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Arab. A lot of love and respect. Shazib, how are you, dear Shazib? Thank you so much for joining to Sitrim, Shazib. Fatima, how are you, dear Fatima? Thank you so much for joining, dear Fatima. Thank you so much for your joining, dear Fatima. Welcome, dear. Welcome. Thank you so much for your joining, guys. Fatima, I write your name, Fatima. Thank you. I will respect and remember. Just have to write your name in the chat, guys, and spread the love on the screen to make the appreciation. Tago, how are you, dear Tago? Thank you so much for your joining, Tago. Hurry up, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Leon, how are you, dear Leon? Thank you so much for your joining. Hartisa, how are you, dear Hartisa? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Hatinsa, thank you so much for your joining. Thank you. Pare, how are you, dear Pare? Thank you so much for joining, Pare. Bali, how are you, dear Bali? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Bali. Alina, how are you, pretty Alina? Thank you so much, dear Alina. How are you, Alina? Pare, I write your name, my dear Alina. I write your name. Thank you so much for your joining, dear Alina. Zolo, how are you, dear Zolo? Thank you so much for your joining to Citrine. Danala, how are you, Danala? Thank you so much, Danala. How are you, dear Danala? Thank you so much for joining. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Mali, how are you, dear Mali? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Mali. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you, guys. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for being there, guys. Jasmine sister, how are you, Jasmine sister? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Jasmine sister. How are you, Jasmine? Thank you so much. Ashley, how are you, dear Ashley? I thank you so much for your joining, Ashley. Ram, how are you? Thank you, Aline. How are you, dear Aline? Thank you so much for your joining, Aline. Emma, Asila, I write your name, Emma. How are you, dear Emma? Thank you so much for joining to sit room, dear Emma. Thank you. Asil, I write your name, Asal. I write your name, my dear. Thank you. Skala, how are you, dear Sakala? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Sakala. How are you, dear Sakala? Thank you so much for joining. Ala, how are you, dear Ala? Thank you so much for your joining, Ala. How are you, Ala? Mia, how are you, Mia? Thank you so much for your joining, Mia. Thank you so much for your joining. Thanos, how are you, Thanos? Thank you so much for joining. Kares, how are you, dear Kares? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Kares. Carrie, how are you, dear Carrie? Thank you so much for your joining, Carrie. Thank you so much for your joining. If you have trying to spam, you will be got the time out, guys. Yeah. Bobby, how are you, dear Bobby? Thank you so much for joining. Zainab, how are you, dear Zainab? Thank you so much for your joining, Zainab. Let me give the time order for those person they are spamming. Yeah, let me give to time order for the person those are time outing. Joy, how are you, dear Joy? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Joy. Amina, how are you, dear Amina? Thank you so much for joining, Amina. Thank you. Shine, how are you, dear Shine? Thank you so much for joining, Shine. CZ, how are you, dear CZ? Thank you so much for joining. And don't write, guys, a lot of name. Thank you. Don't trying to spam. You are still spamming, Shine. Barina, how are you, dear Barina? Thank you so much for joining, Barina. Judith, how are you, Judith? Thank you so much for joining, Judith. And thank you so much for joining. Salini, how are you, Salini? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Salini. Mia, how are you, Maya? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Maya. How are you, Maya? Salini, I write your name pretty. Thank you so much for your joining, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for your joining, guys. Thank you so much for joining. Cuba, how are you, dear Cuba? Thank you so much for your joining. Cameron, how are you, dear? Thank you so much. Salini, I write your name, my dear. How are you, dear Cameron? Thank you so much, my lovely brother. What's doing, Cameron? Thank you so much. Thank you. Jacob, how are you, Jacob? Thank you so much for joining. Jacob, how are you, Jacob? Thank you so much for your joining, my dear. Camo, how are you, dear Camo? Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for your joining. If you have to write, I cannot write. Cameron, dear Cameron, how are you, Cameron? Thank you so much for joining. What's doing right now, dear Cameron? Thank you so much for joining my stream. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Max, how are you, Max? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, Max. Thank you so much, dear Max. A lot of love and respect for your joining, Max. Thank you. Rachel, how are you, dear Rachel? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Rachel. How are you, dear Rachel? Thank you so much for your joining, making the like and subscribing to the channel. No, I am Pakistani, dear. I'm from Pakistan. Okay, Cameron, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much. Lenny, how are you, dear Lenny? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Lenny. A lot of love and respect for you joining, Lenny. Thank you so much for joining my stream. Yusra, thank you so much for subscribing, dear Yusra. Thank you so much, Yusra. Amila, how are you, dear Amila? Thank you so much, dear Amila. A lot of love and respect. Thank you so much for your joining, my dear. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Kingston, how are you, Kingston? Thank you so much, Kingston. Thank you so much for joining my stream, dear Kingston. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you, Alori. I write your name, Alori. Marcel, how are you, Alori? Alori, how are you, Alori? Thank you so much for your joining, Alori. Norris, how are you, Norris? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Marcela, how are you, Marcela? Thank you so much for your joining, Marcela. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Norris, I write your name here. Fatima, how are you, dear Fatima? Thank you so much, Fatima. Emma, how are you, dear Emma? Thank you so much, dear Emma. And lot of love and respect for you, Johnny, Emma. Anestina, how are you, Anestina? Thank you so much for your joining, Anestina. Thank you so much, Anastasia. Thank you so much for joining. Sukod, how are you, dear Sukod? Thank you so much for your joining, Sukod. Roseline, how are you, Roseline? Thank you so much for joining, Roseline. How are you, Roseline? Thank you so much. Roseline, how are you, Roseline? Thank you so much for you joining, Roseline. Thank you so much, my dear. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Mahin, how are you, dear Mahin? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, Mahin. Mahinik, thank you, Mahinik. Thank you so much for you joining, my dear. Martina, how are you, dear Martina? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, Martina. Thank you. And thank you so much for you joining. Thank you, thank you. Love Brazil. Brazil, thank you so much for watching from Brazil. How are you, Brazil? Aurora, how are you, dear Aurora? Sorry. Rodora, how are you, Rodora? Thank you so much for joining, dear Rodora. Noella, how are you, Noella? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Ambol, how are you, dear Ambol? Thank you so much, Ambol. Layam, how are you, dear Layam? Thank you so much for your joining, Layam. Hania, how are you, dear Hania? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Francisco, how are you, dear Francisco? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Francisco. Thank you so much for joining. Anna, how are you, dear Anna? Thank you so much for your joining. Wilson, how are you, dear Wilson? Thank you so much for your joining, Wilson. Thank you so much for your joining, Wilson. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Alex, how are you, dear Alex? Thank you so much for your joining, Alex. Thank you so much for your joining. Avin, how are you, dear Avin? Thank you so much for your joining, Avin. Crystal, how are you, dear Crystal? Thank you so much for your joining. Alize, I write your name, Alize. Era, how are you, Era? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Era. Alison, I write your name, dear Alison. Thank you so much for joining to the stream, dear Alison. How are you, dear Alison? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Liusa, how are you, dear Liusa? How are you, Liusa? Thank you so much for joining. Thank you. Thank you. Melissa, how are you, dear Melissa? Thank you so much for joining, Melissa. Alan, how are you, dear Alan? Thank you so much, Alan. I write your name, dear Alan. Alan, thank you. Melissa, I write your name, my dear. Arde, how are you, dear Arde? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Arde. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Milan, how are you, pretty Milan? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Marlene. Alize, how are you, dear Alize? Thank you so much for joining. Ada, how are you, dear Ada? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Ada. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Jolian, how are you, Jolian? Thank you so much for joining, Jolian. Cecilia, how are you, dear Cecilia? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Cecilia. Yasmin, how are you, pretty Yasmin? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Yasmin. Zayan, how are you, dear Zayan? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Mayas, how are you, Mayas? Aleph, how are you, dear Aleph? Thank you so much for joining, Aleph. Thank you. Carlini, how are you, Carlini? And Caroline, thank you so much for joining to the stream, Caroline. Thank you. Hello, Harold dear. Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Didam, how are you, Didam? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Mylene, how are you, dear Mylena? Thank you so much, Mylena. Zayan, I write your name. Joy, Joy Queen. Thank you so much for joining to the Citrine. Thank you, Amelia. How are you, pretty Amelia? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Amelia. Thank you, Noor. How are you, pretty Noor? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Noor. Samura, how are you, dear Samura? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Samura. Thank you. Zayan, how are you, dear Zayan? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Zayan. Karisan, I write your name many times, Karisan. Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Karisan. Thank you for the sitar. Megan, thank you for the sitar. Thank you. Aria, how are you, dear Aria? Thank you so much for joining, Aria. Thank you. Angelia, how are you, dear Angelique, how are you, Angelique? Thank you so much for joining my citrine. Yeah, guys. Marila, how are you, Marila? Thank you so much for joining to citrine, Marila. Ares, how are you, dear Ares? Thank you so much for joining to citrine, dear Ares. Hurry up, guys. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat. Thank you. Karisan, I write your name here. Looks that there. Thank you so much for your joining. Enaya, how are you, dear Enaya? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Enaya. Angel, how are you, Angel? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, dear Angel. Someone has done a laughing disco, guys. Please send a laughing disco. Or send a laughing disco or flow state, guys. Yasamin, how are you, Yasamina? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Yasamina. Jonah, how are you, dear Jonah? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Jonah. Thank you so much for your joining, dear Jonah. Thank you so much for your joining, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Aram, how are you, pretty Aram? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Aram. Sarah, how are you, Sarah? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. And to write your name in the chat, guys. Anastina, I write your name many times. Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Bahel, I write your name many times. Adi, how are you, dear Adi? Guys, you're spamming. A spamming person to get the time out, guys. Adi, how are you, Adi? Thank you so much for joining, guys. Yeah, Adi, I write your name. Nora, how are you, dear Nora? Thank you so much for joining, Nora. Thank you. Davi, how are you, dear Davi? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Davi. To write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Yusuf, how are you, dear Yusuf? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Jennifer, I write your name. Samara, I write your name. Marila, happy birthday, Marila. Thank you so much for joining, Marila. Happy birthday to Marila. Thank you so much for joining, Marila. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining. Cassidy, how are you, Cassidy? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Thank you, Cassidy. Thank you. Naomi, how are you, Naomi? Thank you so much for joining, Naomi. Thank you. Clarice, how are you, Clarice? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Clarice. Thank you so much for you joining, making the like and subscribing to the channel. David, how are you, dear David? Thank you so much for joining, David. And Crazy, how are you dear Crazy? Thank you so much for joining to a city room, Crazy. Evan, how are you Evan? Thank you so much for joining to a city room, Evan. Thank you. And Theo, how are you Theo? Thank you so much for joining, Theo. How are you Theo? Thank you so much. Lucy, how are you dear Lucy? Thank you so much for joining to a city room, Lucy. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Amateur, how are you dear Amateur? Thank you so much for joining to city room. Aline, how are you dear Aline? Thank you so much for joining, Aline. How are you Aline? Thank you so much for joining. Hatim, how are you dear Hatim? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Hatim. Thank you so much for joining. Arzu, how are you dear Arzu? Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for your joining, Arzu. Arena, how are you dear Arena? Thank you so much for joining to a city room, Arena. Thank you, Seema. How are you pretty Seema? Thank you so much for joining. Tiona, how are you dear Tiona? Thank you so much for joining to the city room, Tiona. Thank you. Thank you, Yusuf. Yusuf, how are you, Yusuf? Thank you so much for joining, Yusuf. A lot of love and respect. Gamali, how are you, dear Gamali? Thank you so much for joining to the city room, Gamali. Thank you. Thank you, Yusuf. I write your name, Yusuf. Why you are spamming? Mackenzie, how are you, Mackenzie? Thank you so much for joining, Mackenzie. Lala, how are you, Lala? Thank you so much for joining, Lala. Yash, how are you, Yash? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Yash. How are you, Yash? Olivia, how are you, Olivia? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Olivia. How are you, Olivia? Amelia, how are you, dear Amelia? Thank you so much for joining, Amelia. How are you, dear Amelia? Thank you so much for joining to city room. RJ, how are you, RJ? Thank you so much for joining. Joseph, how are you, Joseph? Thank you so much for joining to city room. Lala, how are you, dear Lala? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Lala. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat. Lala, I write your name, my dear Lala. Mati, how are you, dear Mati? Thank you so much for joining to city room. Lois, how are you, dear Lois? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Lois. Max, how are you, dear Max? Thank you so much for joining, Max. Megan, how are you, dear Megan? Please send a laughing disco or do a super chat, guys. Maddie, how are you, dear Maddie? Thank you so much for joining to city room, dear Maddie. Lexi, how are you, dear Lexi? Thank you so much for joining to city room. Lorena, how are you, dear Lorena? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Lorena. Lara, how are you, dear Lara? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Lara. Thank you. Just Jai, how are you, Just Jai? Thank you so much for joining. Hi, Just Jai. Alora, how are you, dear Alora? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Alora. How are you, Alora? Thank you, Alora. Hannah, how are you, dear Hannah? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Hannah. Leocas, how are you, dear Leocas? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Leocas. And yeah, Alora, thank you. Jai, how are you, Jai? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin. Caroline, how are you, dear Caroline? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin. Caroline, how are you, Caroline? Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for you joining us, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Leoran, how are you, Leoran? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin, Leoran. Thank you, Leoran. And Celine, how are you, Celine? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin, Celine. Sarah, how are you, Sarah? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin, dear Sarah. Nancy, how are you, dear Nancy? Thank you so much for joining, Nancy. Maggie, how are you, dear Maggie? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin. To write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Fia, how are you, Fia? Thank you so much for joining. Anna, how are you, dear Anna? Thank you so much for joining, dear Anna. Lima, how are you, dear Lima? Thank you so much for your joining, Lima. Lokri, how are you, Lokri? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin. Mayor, how are you, Mayor? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin, Mayor. You keep on giving my names or 20 times add nannies. Logan, how are you, dear Logan? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin, dear Logan. Thank you so much for your joining, my dear Logan. Livia, how are you, dear Livia? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. A lot of love and respect for you joining, guys. I want to know from every person, where are you from watching the screen? Yeah, guys, hurry up to join the Citrin, guys. Thank you so much for you joining, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Alex, how are you, dear Alex? Thank you so much for joining to Citrin, Alex. Sam, how are you, dear Sam? Thank you so much for joining. Sorry, lacking, sorry, my dear. Thank you so much, lacking. Alicia, how are you, dear Alicia? Thank you so much, Alicia. Jose, how are you, dear Jose? Thank you. Anna, thank you, Anna. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Lodu, how are you, Lodu? Amir, how are you, Amir? Thank you so much for joining, Amir. Lana, how are you, dear Lana? Thank you so much for joining, Lana.